Guild has produced some of the most recognizable faces in the media and the arts. Today we sit with one of them who has distinguished himself in both areas. He's a playwright whose works have been performed on radio and on the stage. He's an actor, a director, and a media professional. Francis Quamina Farrier. As a playwright, you've written about 30 odd plays, and of course these were very largely performed at the Theatre Guild. Tell us a little bit about those plays. What were they, and when were they performed?
Well, it wasn't initially my idea to sit down and write what turned out to be The Tides of Susanburg. It was a gentle revolutionary in this country. His name is Rafi Khan. He was the program director of the then Radio Demerara. And at that time, on radio, one got soap operas that came from England and Australia and these metropolitan countries. But Rafi Khan had this idea that there was greatness in Guyana. And apparently he saw some kind of creativity in me that would measure up to what was coming in on the local radio from Australia, from Great Britain. He invited me to come and sit down and have a chat and discuss that possibility of me doing something like that. And I was extremely apprehensive because at that point in my life I had never left the shores of Guyana. And at that point in the history of Guyana, most everything good came from outside. And I say put it good in quotes. Certainly with radio, the principal material, well, it was the news, the BBC News, and all of that came from abroad. So here I was, this very young person, I think I was 24 or 25 at that time, being invited to be a sort of David coming up against Goliath in terms of radio productions. However, when I expressed some measure of trepidation and uncertainty, Mr. Khan said something to me I never ever forget. The magic words, "Francis, I know you can do it." And I wish there were more Rafi Khans in the history of Guyana who can tell people they know they can do something which they feel they probably can't measure up to, and give them that word of encouragement. And Rafi Khan has always been my hero, still is a hero of mine. So it was really his idea. So I sat down and I scribbled out a plot, a plan, what this series is going to be all about, and then came to the name. I don't know how I came about saying Susanburg. I know it was deliberate when I set it on the Essequibo coast for two principal reasons. One, I had spent, and my brothers and I, we spent many happy holiday periods on the Essequibo coast at Queenstown. And two, Essequibo being regarded as the Cinderella County. I say, hey, somebody's bigging me up. Let me big up, well, what was the biggest county, Essequibo, but still regarded as the Cinderella. So that, for those reasons, I set Susanburg midway, somewhere in the vicinity of Anna Regina. And I had the plot out, and as I sat down at my typewriter and started, the plot rolled out, the characters rolled out, and after a while the characters even took over, and they were taking the next episode, they were doing their thing, as it were, while I was simply pounding the typewriter and getting it down on paper.
That must be quite an interesting experience. I mean, for the characters to take over from you and kind of do their own thing, that says something about the power of theatre. And while it was radio theatre, I think you've had a background in the more mainstream forms of theatre for many, many years. I want us to go back a little bit and talk about the formative years, the formative years that really got you involved in this. I know you went to school in Agricola, the Agricola Macdoom area. Tell us a little bit about that.
In the early years, Agricola and Macdoom were well known for some of the most brilliant people. People like Jan Carew, who wrote that novel Black Midas, and that kind of people. Tommy Rhodes is a product of that area. And what happened was the two villages were almost like one, Macdoom and Agricola Macdoom. And they had the theory and they practiced that African saying, it takes a village to raise a child. And everyone looked out for each other's children. I'm not saying that Agricola and Macdoom were the only communities that practiced that. There are many other communities in Guyana that practice that. But people looked after each other's children. And the teachers were hands-on. You had Mr. Fenty, who was the headmaster of the Agricola Methodist, and the other school was Tommy Rhodes's mother. She taught at that school. And we had some brilliant teachers. We had some caring teachers, teachers who looked after the interests of the students, not only their academic needs, but other needs if needs be. So I grew up in that community. Unfortunately, it was a community that had all the 6 races of Guyana. So, you know, when people start to talk about Guyanese 6 races and all of that, it's no big deal for me because I grew up in that environment. And you had the Portuguese shop and the Chinese and the Africans and the Indians, and we had 1 or 2 Amerindians and 1 or 2 Europeans. And so that community of Agricola Macdoom, I wouldn't say what some people are trying to define it as these days, which is very unfortunate. But the Agricola Macdoom of my youth, and we're talking about 70 years ago, 70, because I'm now 75 going into 76. Those communities were looked up at, and we produced a lot of great stuff. So in Agricola, you had the Boys Brigade, you had Boy Scouts, you had a club. Well, I was a member of the youth club, which was called the Agricola Youth Club, but Macdoom boys and girls were members. And we started theatre there. We also did some theatre in the school, where it was poetry, where it was doing skits and that sort of thing. So my theatre upbringing started very early, pre-teen. And then as you got into your teens, you did bigger things. And then Ken Corsby of Theatre Guild, he visited us at my invitation one time, and then he invited me to become involved at the Theatre Guild. So that was the nurturing, if you will, the beginning of my interest and my involvement and my career, if you will, in theatre.
So you go over to the Theatre Guild, and at the Theatre Guild, I'm sure this must have been a totally different environment to the one you'd come from. What were some of the things happening then? These must have been the formative years of the Theatre Guild in and of itself. So what was going on there?
Initially, when I joined the Theatre Guild, they did about 3 or 4 major productions a year. After a while, it was a major production every month. When I got there, I found people who were managers of big companies, who were senior government officials. These were people who held high positions in the society. But theatre, they did theatre. Now, I mean, people play golf and that sort of thing. People go elbow bending and all of that. But theatre was vital and very important. And through theatre, I know many folks, including myself, learned how to express oneself, learned how to debate, if you will, learned how to respect each other, learned how to play the game of, if one looked at cricket or those sorts of games in which you're a team player. So when life puts you in a situation in which you have somebody over you and you're over somebody, you know what was your role. You know what was your involvement, you know, everything that made the outcome of whatever was the objective become successful. And if one were to realize that, look, I'm a team player. So in the theater, like in cricket, football, depending on what position you hold, you know what you're supposed to do, what's expected of you. And you might say, well, okay, I made the most runs, or I scored the most goals, or I'm the star boy in the play. But in the final analysis, it's the others around you who helped you to achieve that success. And one must respect the other person and recognize that that other person, although their role may be a smaller one or less important, it is still very important. And so in the theater of those early years, I learned from those folks. Many of them came from Britain, from Australia, from France, from Canada, from the United States, and other parts of the Caribbean. And you watched them as a youngster. You looked at how they did their roles, and by roles I don't necessarily mean their roles in the play, but how they carried themselves as a member of the Theatre Guild and how they interacted with each other. You know, I know of a case where I was working backstage. A play ran for X performances, and then the last night I knew that the fight that they were doing was a real fight that night. It was the last night of the play. And these two, these two guys had it was a kind of a triangle, if you know what I'm getting at. In those days, they didn't use guns on the competitor. You know, and these two guys were in the play. They were vying for the hand of the beautiful maiden, and they had a fight scene. I was working backstage. The scene took place against that wall. My job was to be on the opposite side of the wall, backstage side of the wall, to brace the wall as these two guys got to the wall and exchange, well, play punches. And that last night, I recognized that real punches were being thrown. You know, and you learned, you know, fellas really, you know. Yeah. But at the end of the fight, the real fight, not play fight anymore, the guys were at the bar having a drink and chatting with each other. You know, that's theater, I dare
that's
say.
Theater. You told me that when you got into the Theatre Guild, there was an opportunity there for you to learn, and you didn't get on stage immediately. You had to do backstage work. What was that like?
It was exciting because one recognized that you were playing a role as well. You weren't playing an on-stage role, but your role was very important. For example, I just gave you the example of me having to brace that wall. Now, my job was to ensure that the set doesn't come crumbling down when the fight, even the mock theater fight, was fairly physical. Even though punches didn't actually land on the other guy's face as happened the final night. Mm-hmm. And you realize, you know, you're important because you are holding that set up as that fight is happening. And there were other jobs, even cleaning the theater, packing the chairs, sweeping, brushing, painting. You did all of that. And you knew that when the audience walked in, because all of this was for the audience, when the audience walked in and they saw a beautiful set, and you saw them smiling and you saw them nodding approval, you said, well, I am part of that. And that also would extend into life, Russell. It extends into life. And it was Ken Cosby who said, theater is life and life is theater. So when you have a play to put on, and you know that the little that you do, the so-called unimportant job that you have, is still very important, because, as we would say, one dirty bill down, every little action goes to the sum of a successful production. So whether it's designing the program, designing the set, getting the furniture, putting it in the right place, if there's a change of scene, to ensure that you get the set off as quickly as possible, and we'll rehearse that. So if your job is to take on a chair and you took 5 seconds, you rehearse it, the director will say, faster. You did it in 4 seconds until you reach the point where you can put it on in 1 second. Zoom, zoom, and you're off. So the blackout would be far shorter, and you continue with the next scene. And you recognize that all of this is what life could and should be, where you be the best of who you are and who you can be. So theater is life, life is theater.
Obviously, this comes right down to the people who were involved. Who are some of the names that you can remember that stuck out for you as being particularly hands-on, particularly involved? Who are the people that you would say are some of the people that contributed to the person that you became?
Let me start with women. 2 women, I would say. Patricia Gomes and Eileen McAndrew. Patricia Gomes was one of the most brilliant actresses. Eileen McAndrew was the. She was fantastic. And these are women who took their theater extremely serious. Not that they used to have fun, but you have more fun when you have less fun when you shouldn't be having fun, so that you can have all the fun. Let me explain that. You have fun at the end of the production when people come and shake your hand, kiss you, slap you in the back, offer you a drink because you did a good job. How did you come to do a good job? Because once you are cast in the role, you're given the script, you get serious, and you're going down the road and you're rehearsing your line. And somebody goes past, "Hey boy, I'm not a madman." And you say, "Ah boy, mad, eh? I loaded me lines here." So when you're walking down the road or riding or whatever, and you're going over the lines in your head or wherever you are, that is serious work, because you want to have fun later. And you can't have fun with people who you have entertained with the best performance that you can do. You're not Sir Laurence Olivier, even though at one point in my career, because of Laurence Olivier, the great British actor, I figured I could have become a Sir Laurence Olivier. You know, I aim for the sky. And I used to look at Sir Laurence Olivier's performance. But to come back to the Theatre Guild in Guyana, we had some actors and actresses here. I wouldn't want to say they were as good as Sir Laurence Olivier, because who could be better than Sir Laurence Olivier? But they were good. They were really good. These are people who could perform opposite or with Sir Laurence Olivier. And I go back to Patty Gomes and Eileen McAndrew. You had other people, many others who, well, unfortunately, whose names I can't remember right now. Lorna McAndrew, and those are the women. You had Frank Thomason, of course, Ken Corsby, Dennis Lilliman, and a host of these folks who were, and let me come back, because I'm saying this with a measure of who listening here. These were people who were in top executive positions, either in government or in the private sector, and they found theatre as something good, where they could exchange intellectual conversations, and sometimes not so intellectual conversations, who could discuss politics, who could define where they want to take the Theatre Guild, and by extension where they want to take Guyana. So in the Theatre Guild, you had people who were actors, but who were head people in the government, the public service, if you will, and private sector, who had to make plans for their company. What will my company be doing? What will be the fiscal turnover if it's, well, in those days we hardly had thousands, far less more billions. How many $100? And in those days, 100. Okay, just let me say this quickly, Russell. The first car I bought, I paid $850 for it. Okay, so you see how much $850 could buy. Can't even buy a gallon of gasoline now, I believe. I don't know. But I could buy a whole car with $850. So coming back to these guys at the Theatre Guild, they had to make their business or their department, whether it's the public service or the private sector, successful. So they brought that experience to the Theatre Guild, and they brought it to productions that they were doing. And I learned looking, seeing how these people operated. In fact, I always say that Theatre Guild of yore, in the 50s and 60s and 70s and even into the 80s, was a university. It was a university because all those people I just referred to were like university professors. They knew what they were all about. They knew how to do it and how to do it successfully. And people like myself, going back 60 years, learned from these people as if I were going to a university. And I learned quite a lot. And so when the time came for me to be doing bigger things, and I'm not suggesting that getting on stage, playing a starring role is any bigger than playing a minor role, because I remember the first big theatre workshop that I attended at Theatre Guild. It was run by the late Errol Hill, and he loved telling stories to drive home certain points. And let me repeat this story quickly. A young lady was given a part in a big production that had 20 people on stage at one time. And she was just, in her mind, making up numbers. So she stood on the extreme right, and she was not in the least interested in what was happening in center stage. And the main players, they were doing their thing, and they had the audience entranced, and you know. And so she was just looking up at the proscenium arch and couldn't care less, and she's glancing, she's looking, you know. And so this lady in the front row, she saw this young lady looking, and she looked up, her husband side of her looked up, the next person looked up, the person in the next row looked up, and the entire audience were all looking up to see who, what, where, why be looking up. And the actors on stage, seeing the audience all looking up, lost control, lost their focus, and their whole play collapsed. And Errol said, and all because one little girl thought that she was so unimportant. Life is theatre, theatre is life. We are all important. And the people who try to make anybody feel unimportant isn't worth whatever they're being paid. So that experience, whether it was true or not, that Errol Hill spoke about the young lady who thought she was so unimportant, but she made an entire production collapse, and the people went home grumbling because the play just fell apart. All things fell apart. So these were the kinds of things that I learned as a youngster. You are important, but on the other hand, one must recognize that the other person is important too. So you play the game of, whether it's cricket or football, and we're all in there to win, but we could only win if we ensure that we play the part of a team player. You're not alone. We're all, so whether you're president or pauper, whether you're policeman or priest, all the P's, you know that I've gone beyond 3 P's. Policeman, pauper, priest, prisoner, all the P's. You are still perennially important. You're always important, and you must consider the other person as you consider yourself. And therefore, I learned a lot being at the Theatre Guild, being at what I would refer to as a university.
While you were at the Theatre Guild, obviously you must have been involved with a number of productions. What are some of those that stand out for you?
Well, at Theatre Guild they did most of the Shakespearean plays, and they did a lot of non-Guyanese plays. One of the plays, I always would remember the title, if it were to be done now, it was called In a Backward Country. Well, of course, nobody would write a play with such a title anymore. You'd write a play called In a Developing Country, you know, not in a backward country. We played, I love playing around with titles and that sort of thing. So we did most of the old British plays that you could think of, the American plays that you could think of. And then we started to do plays from the Caribbean. We did a lot of Derek Walcott plays. But the breakthrough with Guyanese plays came with Frank Pilgrim's Miriami. Miriami broke the box office records up to that point. and it was played again and again and again. And like Susan Berg, Miriami was a play set in a mythical place called St. Midas, an island in the Caribbean. Frank Pilgrim brought that. Miriami, like the book and the movie Rebecca, never is seen. Rebecca in that movie is never seen. She is spoken of, although the movie carries that title. So Miriami is never seen, but she's spoken of all the time. Miriami, in fact, she was supposed to be an unwed mother, and she was getting twins. So the media were all over the place trying to get interviews. They were trying to find who the father of the child was, and it was a fantastic play. But what I liked about Miriami, and I patterned some of my plays from that, is that you had, if you will, the gamut of characters. So you had the drunky man, and you had the doctor, and the in-betweens. And that is important for present-day playwrights to understand, that life isn't only made up of the plebs of society, if you will, the dregs of society. Life is theatre, and theatre is life. And my feeling is one has to take into consideration that you have your decent people. Now, in Miriami, the play by Frank Pilgrim, you had a larger-than-life character who was Miriami's sister. And she was trying, she was the Miss Dog's body. She was making contact with everybody in the cast, the doctor, the reporter, and all these various people. And you never saw Miriami, as I mentioned. You saw the person who turned out to be the father of the child. And you saw the Miss Goody-Goody, who was doing her best to ensure that Miriami and the child father get married before the birth of the babies and all of that. So you had the gamut of characters. Life is theatre, and theatre is life.
All right, so tell me, I know you've written a number of plays. Can you remember how many you've written, and maybe tell us some of the names of some of them?
Look, I'll tell you about the play I'm going to write next, I believe. It's a play entitled The Plays That I've Written That I Cannot Remember Which I've Written. That's the title of that play. Now, that's in a kind of a smart way of answering your question. But let's say that I've written well over 20 plays, maybe 30. Some of them are one actor, some of them are full length. Some of them are radio plays. Well, there was even one movie called Operation Macanaima. So if it went into the realm of the cinema, I've written a number of documentaries, plays. Okay. Now, I've written plays like Plight of the Right, The Slave and the Scroll, Manaka, and quite a number of others. Some I can't remember. There was Freedom Trail, quite a number of plays. As I keep saying, sometimes the titles elude me, but there was one that I must mention, which was a radio play called The Echoes of the Savannas. And why I mention that in this special kind of a way, it was because the plot of that play was a short poem. And if we were to talk about sources of plays, you could just hear somebody goes down the road and mentions something, and it is the genes of a play. So that poem was one which I called Echoes of the Savannas. But there are many, many plays. Of course, the Susan Berg plays and all of that.
All right. So just give us a broad idea of when your plays were performed at the Theatre Guild.
Well, I don't have a log, as it were, Russell, but I know the first play was a play called Border Bridge, and that was done at a workshop, the same workshop that I alluded to in Errol Hill, and that was done by the participants of the workshop. I think just myself and another writer actually did writing. Others did voice. Well, we also did voice and movement and that sort of thing, and then we continued doing plays like Manaka and a number of one-act plays. We did talk about The Plight of the Right and The Slave and the Scroll. They were done. Critters, that's another one. They're coming back. They were done, I would say, primarily in the mid to late 60s. Yeah. And they were done at what we call club nights. Club nights in the old days at the Theatre Guild used to be a Thursday night. It was a night when audiences came in, they didn't pay, they just walked in the theatre, and people did their own thing, whether it was a musical night or telling jokes or reading poetry, that sort of thing. The bar made the money, because when people came to club nights, the bar was open. People bought drinks, whether it's beer, rum, soft drinks, or what have you, and the bar made the money. And people interacted, people socialized, and people got to know each other, because it was a relaxing evening. Sometimes it lasted hour and a half, sometimes it lasted half an hour. The main thing is, it gave an opportunity for unknowns, if you will, to become known, to show off their talent, and to get a foot into the more senior aspect of the theatre. Of course, there was a junior section later, but club nights would be where my earlier plays were done.
I want to make a distinction between amateur theatre and professional theatre and commercial theatre. Obviously, the Theatre Guild was a place where amateur theatre was going on, but it was amateur theatre of a very high quality. Where would you say that theatre became, quote-unquote, commercial, and how is this distinguished from what I will call professional theatre?
Now, the Theatre Guild in the old days functioned in this way. They got a grant from the government. They got a grant from most of the big companies in those days, because, as I mentioned, a lot of managers were members of the Theatre Guild. So, unlike today, when the managers go off and play golf or whatever, those managers were involved with the theatre. In the same way how managers of today would have X $1 million, this for charity and this for whatever, they would ensure that there is something there for the Theatre Guild. So the Theatre Guild thrived. They paid their bills, their electricity bills, what have you. And so they didn't pay the actors. And for that reason, it was called an amateur theatre. But people performed at professional level. Very, very high quality acting, directing. The plays that were put on there were of very, very high quality. I've seen plays in Britain, in England, in America, in Canada, that Theatre Guild's plays were even and sometimes better in terms of the quality of the production and the quality of the acting, the Theatre Guild of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Oh, yes.
But in terms of the commercial sense, at a commercial level, did people pay to come in, and where did that money go?
Well, yes, people did pay to come in, but remember, every production has a cost. And so, in most cases, I believe, the box office was able to cover the cost. If not, there was these grants that came in from different business houses, you know, whether it's Booker's or Banks DIH, or these are various called Fogarty's and these other companies. They gave something to the Theatre Guild every year. So Theatre Guild, I can't say they ever had any financial difficulties. Yeah.
How do you look at it in comparison with what I will call the contemporary commercial vein that theatre has taken? And also, most of the plays now are written not with what I will call a broad swathe in terms of its societal representations. Most of the plays are about only a small section, what we will call the ghetto kind of
Let's say it,
approach.
Russell, most of the plays are about domestic violence of a negative nature. In fact, there were plays in the past that had a measure of domestic violence. But it always happened off stage, not on stage, as the case might be. And let's face facts, things change, so people do it on stage. But then, at the end of the play, what have you left with the audience? What thoughts, what corrective measures, if you will, what influences have you really given to somebody sitting out there who are seeing this enactment of what we just show it as happened is what is said? I don't know. I think that a playwright, if you consider yourself a playwright, is a leader, is someone who should consider him or herself to be the conscience of the society and the change of the, what should I say, the weaknesses of the society. You show society what it could be, not necessarily what it must be, because you're not dictating, you're not a dictator. You're suggesting to the society. And I like when somebody said to me, you know, it don't have to be this or that. It could be this and that. And playwrights and directors and actors and poets have got to understand, and many do, that you can make an impression on society, but you're not making demands. You're making suggestions and you're making recommendations, and you're hoping that what you've got to say has got validity and that people will indeed consider, even if they consider what you have put out there to them. But if all you're showing them is man beating up woman and woman beating up man, amen, so what, big deal. Why then write the play? It hasn't got any substance to offer. It hasn't got suggestions, it hasn't got recommendations. And I'm not talking about a morality play in which brings down hell and damnation and on the evil doers in the land. All I'm saying is that a play must be able to titillate people's imagination. What could we do? And there's a play which I'm planning to do also, which has to do with a certain geographical something of Guyana. And if I'm saying that if the leaders of this country were to look at some of the plays that were written around independence and listen carefully to some of the songs and the poems that were written around independence time, as we come to our 50th independence anniversary, which is around the corner. So hopefully, even what I'm saying now would titillate some imagination. People will be writing poetry, songs on our 50th anniversary. I was in Ghana the other day for their 55th independence anniversary, and I did some back research because I should have gone there for their 50th anniversary. Those people were planning 5-6 years in advance for their 50th anniversary. And Guyana's 50th anniversary is coming along. We gotta get up and do things, get plans. Don't let just a few of us be planning at this point in time. Yeah. Russell?
Thank you.
My pleasure. Sometimes I can't even remember a playwright. Serious, I've written over 20 plays. Honest to God. Sometimes I can't. Man, shucks, man, the play that I would really be stumbling. What you say?
Yeah, just tell us how many plays you've written. Alright, I'll just ask the question and you'll tell.
I gotta say about.
And if you can remember some of the names.
Alright. Sit up at the very hard seat right now. The cheer boy, you're going to fire extinguisher. You see what I mean? I get it now. Cut. Ah, she knows what I mean. All right, okay, good. Let me start again.